two, three, four.
Hi everyone, this is Jewish Talk, coming to you from Nassau Community College on 90.3 WHBC, also streaming on the iHeart and the iTunes app. This program is later archived on Spreaker.com. So, hi there, my name is Rabbi Perl. Guess what? It's time for Jewish Talk. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This, of course, depends on when you're listening and joining us. So I first want to begin with a story. The story is called The Little Boy Who Put the World Back Together. I share this with you because we are living in unprecedented times, challenging times, when we all look to put the world back together. Here's the story and the lesson each of us can learn. Every day at 5 p.m., Dad would come home after a heavy day at the office. His little boy was only 4 years old. He would come running down the stairs shouting, Daddy's home, wow! He would jump into his father's arms, begging him to play with him. Play with him, a child. But his father, who had a hard day at work, was too tired to play right at that moment. He would tell his son, not now, maybe after dinner. His son would reply, okay, Dad, after supper, then we'll play. After dinner, Dad would head for the living room, especially after those heavy meals, and crash out on the sofa in front, of course, the TV. Little boy would come rushing into the living room, full of smiles and glee, all ready to play with his daddy, only to be disappointed to see his dad deep asleep on the couch. This went on for some time, and quite frankly, little boy was getting a little bit tired of this situation. He decided that this Sunday he would get his father to play with him, no matter what. Sunday came, and the little boy knew that today was a day that he could hardly wait to get to play with his dad. Of course, his father didn't go to work on Sundays. What little boy didn't know that day, the Sunday, was the day of the big game. And every father in the country was getting ready to watch the big game on TV. Dad was in the living room getting all set up. You know how these guys are. The TV was positioned just right. His bowl of potato chips was within arm's reach. His remote strategically placed on his right for quick control. He was just sitting in on the couch when the little boy came running into the living room, jumped into his daddy's lap, snatching up the remote from him and turning the TV and, of course, the big game off, laughing and giggling and tickling his father, saying, come on, Daddy, let's play. We're going to play today no matter what. But his dad didn't want to play. He wanted to watch the big game, and this was really getting him upset. You know, I guess his dad hadn't taken the seminar, the live stream seminar, so he was a little bit unscented about it. His daddy did, however, love him, and he didn't want to scold him for interrupting his big game, so he needed a diversion. And then it hit him. It was a clever plan, a most ingenious scheme that would keep his sons busy, so he'd have plenty of time to watch the big game all afternoon. On the coffee table, Dad saw a magazine with a picture of the planet Earth on the front cover. He said to his son, do you see this picture of the world? Tearing the cover off the magazine? The little boy replied, yes. Thinking he finally had won, his dad was going to now play with him. Taking the little boy to the kitchen table and ripping the picture of the world into little pieces, mixing them up on the table, and giving his son some scotch tape, he said, when you put the picture back together, we'll play, okay? His son said, okay, Daddy, and started to work on the puzzle. Dad went back to the living room, sat on the couch, getting comfortable and turning the big game back on, thinking to himself, it'll take him all afternoon for him to figure out and to put this puzzle back together. Dad had no sooner started watching the game when his son came running into the living room, shouting with glee, I did it! Look, Daddy, I did it! I taped the picture back together. His dad couldn't believe his eyes, saying, "How did you do it so fast?" The little boy looked up at his daddy and said, "When you tore the cover off the magazine, I noticed a picture of a little boy on the back of it. I just knew if I pasted that little boy back together, the world would come together too." My friends, there's so many meanings to this story. What jumps off the pages, so to speak, is that if we, looking at the world today, it's all over the place. But if we put ourselves together, the world will be together. Instead of blaming the world for this and blaming the world for that, if we bring ourselves together, then automatically the globe would be at peace. So with that in mind, I want to bring to your attention that we now find ourselves on the Jewish calendar in a rather period of mourning. The 3 weeks it's called. And during these 3 weeks that began on the 17th day of Tammuz and concludes on July 30th with the fast day of Tisha B'Av, we reflect back on the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem. And during this time, the Lubavitcher Rabbi explained to us that we're not just simply reflecting back on the destruction and feeling its loss, but we must do everything we can to rebuild it. How we're supposed to rebuild the temple, the third temple in Jerusalem, and that is by studying the measurements and the uses and the meaning of the temple in Jerusalem. And the Rebbe would often quote from Yecheskel, the great prophet Yecheskel, Hezekiel, who God said to him that you must go and teach the children how the temple looked. This was at the period of time when the temple had just been destroyed. And the prophet Yecheskel said, "Master Universe, why are you telling me to go and tell them the form of the house? They're now in exile. Is there anything they can do about it? When they come back, I'll inform them. I'll tell them how it looks and all the measurements." God says, "Listen, should the construction of my house be ignored because my children are in exile?" And the God went on to declare that the study of the design of the temple, of the Beis HaMikdash, can be equated to the actual construction. Go tell them to study the form of the temple, and as a reward for their study and their occupation, I will consider it as if they've actually built the temple itself. So with that in mind, I'd like to share with you first a fascinating insight about an individual who ended up sleeping on the Temple Mount, and then more about the temple itself. And I'm sure you're well aware of the Torah is telling us about Jacob, and we find that Jacob, when he's leaving his father's home, he ends up falling asleep, and when he wakes up, he realizes he's on the Temple Mount. And that Temple Mount, of course, is the place today where you have the Western Wall, upon which we have where the temple was, the first and second temples were standing. And we look forward very speedily for the coming of Mashiach, and that third temple will be rebuilt on that Temple Mount. So here's something fascinating about that encounter of Jacob, where he fell asleep. Here, let me introduce it from an interesting perspective. Most people who have a brain would agree that it is a most useful tool. But there is a considerable disagreement as how and when we're supposed to use it. Some say, that the purpose of the brain, I use my intellect for the physical, material challenges of life. To run my business, to write a resume, to purchase a home, to build a boat, to program my TV. These are the kinds of things for which reason, that means the mind, the logic, will serve as a dependable guide in doing all these things. But when it comes to my inner spiritual life, my religious convictions, my love for my family, my times for meditation and prayer, these cannot be rationalized or weighed with the scales of logic. That's not when I use my mind. These are areas in which I surrender to my subconscious, something, intuitive of myself. That's one way of looking at it. Others take an opposite approach. On the contrary, they say, the spiritual side of life is where the mind's guidance is most necessary, precisely because of its loftiness, and it's most vulnerable to corruption. So therefore, regarding my material endeavors, my regular activities, I can allow myself to operate kind of an automatic pilot. Besides, they're not that important to me. If they don't work out exactly as they should, it's not the end of the world. But in my spiritual life, which is much more important to me, I want to get it right. And therefore, I submit my every action, my thought, and my feelings to the most precise measurement tool I've got. That's my brain. And these, my friends, are the two ways of looking for what is my brain, to be used for material things, and my spirituality is left to something subconscious. Or another way of looking to say, no, I use my brain for my spirituality and leave the rest of the things, just to everything else. Who's right and who's wrong? Well, according to the fascinating medrash I'm about to share with you about Jacob's sleeping habits, both are wrong. What we read in the 28th chapter of Bereshit, Genesis, we see how Jacob, while journeying from the Holy Land to Haran, spends a night on Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, as I mentioned. Torah says he encounters the place, he slept there, for the sun had set, and he lay down in that place. Now, sages who explain to us every word in the Torah is exact. Torah does not contain any extra words. And therefore they question, what's the meaning when it says that he lay down? Come on. We've already been told that he slept there. So what's the message behind these words? That he lay down. Says the Medrash, a fascinating thing. In that place, on Temple Mount, he lay down. But for all the 14 years prior that he was hidden in the house of Ava, which is a yeshiva, he didn't lie down. In that place, he lay down. But for all the 20 years that he was in Lavan's house, he did not lie down. What we're saying is that this was the first time he went to sleep. In the previous 14 years, when he was home and he'd gone to yeshiva, he didn't lay down. He was awake. He was learning. And the following years, when he was with his Lavan, with his father-in-law and working, etc., he also didn't lay down. Therefore, that night, Torah is telling us, the night that Jacob spent at the holiest place on earth was framed by the most intensively spiritual and most intensively material periods of his life. He, on the one side, he had spent 14 years in yeshiva, which is a very spiritual experience, and the following 20 years he would be working, so he was involved very much in material things. So Jacob was secluded in the home of his teacher, Aver, which was Noach's great-great-grandson, devoting every moment in the pursuit of divine wisdom. And so therefore he's involved in very spiritual things. Then the following 20 years, following that night, Jacob worked with his uncle Lavan, tending to Lavan's sheep and amassing everything that he had to do there. And by his own testimony, his devotion to the task of working for his father-in-law, he never slept. So think about this. He never slept during his spiritual side of his life, 14 years in yeshiva. He never slept in the following, the 20 years when he was working for a living. But between the one night that connected between these two worlds, these two periods of his life, There the Torah says he lay down. Now what's the significance? Obviously, he went to sleep a little bit, in either side of his life, in his 14 years or the 20 years. So what is it deeper meaning when we say that Jacob lay down and slept in that, and by emphasizing that not just simply he slept, but he lay down in that one night time which connected these two periods of his life. You see, when a person lies down, the position, you lie down, the position of your head and the rest of your body is on the same plane, right? You're lying down. By doing so, he surrenders the most important advantage that a human being has over all other animals. The fact that in the human being, the head is positioned above the body. Along comes the Hasidic masters and teachers. Man's upright stature, the fact that when we stand, we're upright, is much more than just simply a feature of one's physical anatomy. So when you're standing, your head is up and your feet are below. And when you're lying down, your feet and your head are on the same level. Rather, it reflects a deeper truth. That in the human being, the mind rules the head. The purpose when you stand and your head is above is that the mind rules the heart. The head is the master of the physical self. This, says the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya, is the inborn nature of every one of us. A person who allows himself to be ruled by his emotions or instincts is a person who has renounced the most important feature of his humanity, the most important priority of man over the beast. This, says the Lubavitcher Rebbe, is the deepest significance of the Medrash statement that Jacob did not lie down either during his 14 years in spirituality in the house of Ava, nor in a very physical sense during his 20 years when he was working for a living. Jacob is telling us that the mind rules the heart. That rule applies to every area of one's life, from the most spiritual endeavor to the most material of occupations. All areas of life, that is, except when you're on Mount Moriah. This is the point. He was standing up during the spiritual part of his life, 14 years. He was standing up during his more material side of his life for 20 years. So those 34 years, he was standing. He was using his mind over his heart. But suddenly now when he's leaving the land of Israel and he finds himself and he lies down on Mount Moriah, he's now lying down, where his head and his feet are all on the same level. Because there is also a higher truth, a truth that transcends physicality and spirituality, a truth surpassing both the intellect and the instinct. At that particular pivotal point at Mount Moriah, God is neither, it was a recognition, God is neither spiritual nor physical. He created both realms and is equally present in both. He provides us the avenues of connecting to Hashem's higher truth in both venues. Prayer, for example, is a spiritual venue that connects us to Hashem, while giving charity is a physical pathway as well. And He provides us with a guide, a rational mind, which is our mind, with which to navigate both areas of our life. But we also need to be connected to the higher divine truth. That means even though in our physical life, in our spiritual life, the mind must control the heart, we also have to recognize there's an aspect of ourselves that transcends both the material or the spirit and the matter. And therefore, it is only because of this connection that we can inhabit two such diverse worlds and even incorporate them both into our lives. So that is why Jacob had to spend a night on Mount Moriah, the site of the Holy Temple, the place of God's deepest self-revelation to man, and man's ultimate commitment in his service to the Almighty God, the place where all the divine truth is manifest. So only an encounter with Mount Moriah, the connection to the temple, the connection to the location, as manifested by Jacob, he was able, in the deepest sense, to bridge his spiritual years when he was in the yeshiva for 14 years and his Lavan years when he was involved in his activities for 20 years. That encounter at Mount Moriah, that places our spiritual endeavors and our material pursuits in the same life, because both became the same, caused them to dwell peacefully with each other, harmoniously with each other, and even feed and nourish each other, and impose the same standards of integrity to both. So in other words, there should never ever be a dichotomy in life where a person somewhat, cuts in half. This is my spiritual life, I'm that way, and this is my material life, that's another way. Mount Sinai brings it both together. He was there lying down. But on Mount Moriah, there were no rules or no tools. You cannot grasp or apprehend. You cannot rationalize or experience. Mount Sinai is when you surrender. You can only lie down, so to speak. That lying down was a recognition that you can actually, as Yaakov went, he was now transcending, going from one spiritual to another. He was getting this lesson that there's a certain aspect of a person that must, in a sense, surrender itself. So in our personal life, our Mount Moriah are extremely rare to be able to see ourselves that way. For Jacob, a single night was enough for 34 years. He got that lesson, and that's how he was able to live his life in a very harmonious, synchronized way. What about ourselves? What's important is not how often they come, how long they last, but their influence should pervade everything that we do. And that's a very important point in the world that we live, and especially when we're now in the 3 weeks, when we are thinking about the rebuilding of the third temple and doing everything we can to bring the third temple into being. And of course, in a broader sense, the importance of the third temple is to bring peace into this world. Right? Today, there's such disconnect. There's so many arguments and so many different opinions, and even with the COVID, do this with the mask, without the mask, this problem, that matters, this doesn't matter, who knows matter, everybody matters. It's all over the place. There lacks a sense of harmony in this world. And as I mentioned in our earlier little story, the harmony must begin within the person. Someone who lives in a harmonious life speaks about harmony, lives a harmonious life, has enough room in their world, a place for everybody, because it's not just about themselves. And this is what Yaakov teaches us. Whatever part of his life, he was standing up. He didn't lie down. His mind was awake. He was using his mind, and it was his mind was controlling everything he was doing. He was doing his spirituality properly. He was doing his involvement in the world with integrity and honesty properly. But deep down, a person must know that every aspect of his life is all connected to the Almighty God. And that's what the Temple Mount is all about. A recognition of a location, at least one place in the world, on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where this sense of harmony, where just like when a person is lying down, his head and his feet are all on one level. It's not about his mind. It's about the deeper connection of how we are, in a sense, connected to Almighty God that permeates and brings everything together in a most beautiful manner. So there is so much about the temples. One of the things that on the Temple Mount in the times of the first and second temple was the mitzvah of guarding a temple. And obviously you know that the Kohanim and the Levites, it was their job, and part of their activities was to guard the temple. There's a discussion, what was the purpose of guarding the Temple Mount? And there is two opinions, Rashi and Rambam. Rashi says the purpose of the Levites and the Kohanim guarding different locations was simply out of security, to make sure the wrong people didn't come in. People had to be pure, and there are many areas that are off limits. So therefore, the purpose of the guards was to, in a sense, to watch over and to act as security guards. But then the Rambam writes, Maimonides is of the opinion that the temple was like a palace. And just like a palace is honored by having guards standing in the front, like we have Lahavdil, Buckingham Palace in London. You have these well-dressed, ceremonial kind of persons. It adds honor to the building, right? You have just like you have a building with concierge downstairs, right? It's a different kind of feeling when you walk into the lobby and you have someone there who greets you, opens the door, a doorman. It adds honor to the building and the location. So the Rambam writes that the purpose of the Kohanim and the Leviim to guard over the temple was acting as honor guards, because of course this was the temple area. Either way, obviously there's not a contradiction, because they could actually serve the same guard could be serving both purposes, both as a security guard as well as acting and giving honor to the place. But what's interesting is that this was only during the daytime. It was only during the nighttime when these guards were in operation. But during the daytime, there was no need for the guards. Why would that be? Because during the daytime, everybody was busy. You could see, and the same Kohanim and the Leviim doing their work. They could watch out to control who comes in and goes in terms of security. And at the same time, because they were doing all the activities of bringing the sacrifice and the offerings and comings and going, there was no need to have the honor guards, because the honor, the greatest thing of the temple, the greatest honor you can bring is the activities. But at night, when there was none of the above, that's of course the time when you need to have the guards. The question is, today we don't have guards standing on Temple Mount in terms for the temple itself, and because of the danger involved, obviously on the way it is today on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But on a deeper sense, though, just like these temples, the temple first and the temple second needed a guard, whether for security reasons or to honor the location, so too ourselves, we are a temple. God rests in every human being. And just like the temple in Jerusalem needed guards, we too must guard over the holiness of ourselves. What's the holiness of ourselves? Of course, is the neshama, the soul. So we have to stand strong to secure that our soul is not in any way soiled by the world, all activities. It stays holy. And at the same time as well, we honor our souls by standing guard and making sure it fulfills its mission in this world. This is your host, Rabbi Perl, wishing you the best. Have a wonderful week.
1, 2.